this is one of my actual favorite scriptures in all of the Bible. Jesus has just completed a national tour, if you will, of Israel. Not like we think of rock bands going around the world, because there were no such things as buses or cars or vans or planes, but rather this was a walking tour. And Jesus and his disciples had gone into areas of Israel that they normally were not accustomed to being in. And Jesus had been talking to the disciples all along this walking tour of the country about things of how God desired the world to be, about things that were going to happen to Jesus. Along that walking tour, Jesus shares with the disciples that one day he will be killed. He will be betrayed and killed, and on the third day he will rise again. But the disciples really didn't get that. And all along this way, Jesus now returns to his hometown, and you think there'd be this great homecoming celebration or party, but you and I are told in the Gospel of Mark that rather Jesus wants to be by himself to share special teachings with his disciples. Along this whole tour that they were on, Jesus shares with his disciples the cost of following Jesus and what it means to take up your cross. But the disciples, they didn't get it. Along that tour, Jesus shared with the disciples that, in fact, Elijah had returned to prepare the coming of the Messiah, that indeed John the Baptism was Elijah. But the disciples, they didn't get that. All through this tour, Jesus supported, affirmed, encouraged, and loved those people in society that society itself saw as irrelevant or not important. Jesus healed them. Jesus brought new life and a word of hope to them. And Jesus forgave their sins. But the disciples, they didn't get that either. Now Jesus is home. And Jesus takes this time to talk more closely to the disciples that he's with. And he hears a conversation that occurs along the way. He asks the disciples, just what were you arguing about on the road to our house? The disciples are silent because more than likely they're a bit embarrassed over what they were arguing about. They were arguing about who was the greatest among them. Who was the greatest among them? Perhaps they had this objective standard of who was with Jesus at the most impressive miracle that Jesus performed, or who spent the most time with Jesus. Whatever it was, they were debating and arguing and fighting over who among them was the greatest. But as Jesus knew this conversation had occurred, Jesus wanted no part of it and was not impressed. Jesus joins into that discussion and says to the disciples, whoever wants to be first or greatest among you must be last. Whoever wants to be first or greatest among you must be servant to all. This discussion of greatness that began 2,000 years ago continues in our world today. In the mid-1970s, there was a very tall, strong African-American man who once said, I fly like a butterfly and sting like the bee. I'm the greatest of all. I'm Muhammad Ali. And the discussion ensued in that time, who was the greatest boxer of all time? Last year in Super Bowl 52, a Super Bowl which I might add the Eagles won, the Eagles played the New England Patriots, and all year long, us Eagles fans had to endure Tom Brady as the GOAT, the greatest of all time. And fights begin in sports bars. Was it Tom Brady? Was it Bart Starr? Was it John Elway? Was it Joe Montana? Who is the greatest of all time? People this weekend are fighting over who is the greatest golfer of all time. Tiger Woods is having a wonderful tournament, but is the greatest golfer Jack Nicklaus, Arnold Palmer, or even Ed Little? maybe Fred Kunkel, right? But these arguments ensue. Who is the greatest president of all time? Who is the greatest church person of all time? Who has the greatest church of all time? Jesus knew something about the disciples and knows something about us. Somehow we like to measure subjective standards in greatness. And not only do we like to measure those standards, but it seems that humans, we like to debate over those topics, fight over those topics, and at times even start wars over topics such as who is the greatest. Most people assume that greatness deals with power or accomplishment, that greatness somehow refers to a person's fame or material wealth, or perhaps the influence they have over the world. But Jesus shares a word with you and I that defines greatness like this. Who among you will walk with humility with God? Who will be humble in the presence of God? Who sees themselves as lowly in this world instead of trying to lift themselves into a position of affluence? Who sees themselves as providing service to all the people whom they meet? Who sees themselves as dedicating their lives to serve the Lord and not themselves? Who among us takes great joy and is eager to spend time and uplift the least and most vulnerable in our society? This is what Jesus says is greatness. Greatness. Jesus' version of greatness sure doesn't work in our world, right? It has no place in the real world in which you and I live. A world that's measured by power, affluence, wealth, income. Jesus has no idea what he's talking about greatness, because Jesus doesn't understand our country or our times. But wait a minute. What if you and I actually measured greatness the same way Jesus does? What if we measured greatness by our ability to see another person in the same eyes and the same light that our God sees them, and to offer our help, offer our services instead of words of condemnation or indignation? What if we saw greatness as how much of our lives do we actually dedicate to living that life toward the kingdom of God? Versus how much time do I have to spare to spend time with God? What if greatness really was defined by how we see ourselves serving other people in the world in which we live, how we see ourselves as ambassadors of the God of this time, versus just doing our own thing, trying to take care of ourselves and our family? What if we saw greatness as the person who allows themselves to be vulnerable enough to actually share a word of peace and hope and love with someone who the world rejects and sees as ugly or somehow dirty or unclean or unworthy? I don't know about you, but maybe the world, or at least our little corner of this world, would truly be a great place to live. Remember, even while Jesus is teaching these things to the disciples, he's now firmly on the road to Jerusalem. Even while Jesus is talking about these things to his brothers and sisters in Christ, Jesus is willing to take on the form of humanity and humble himself, walking to a cross in which he knows he will die and rise again on the third day. Jesus is willing to give everything, all that our Lord has to offer in service to us. That's greatness. That makes Jesus Christ the GOAT, the greatest of all time. And the good news for you and I is that never once did Jesus give up on the old or the young. Jesus never gave up on those who were brilliantly smart or those who were kind of dim-witted like the disciples. Jesus never gave up on the strong and affluent, nor did he give up on the weak and the poor. Jesus didn't even give up on the disciples who should have known better, who walked on the roads with him, or the disciples who walked in Bethlehem in the year of our Lord 2018. Jesus' vision of greatness allows you and I to be inspired to have a better world, to work